Okay. All right. So could I just get your name and profession?
My name is Gavin Pritchard, and I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist. I'm also a professional chef.
Great. That's perfect. So, I'm just gonna get straight to the questions. So, the first one is, how do you define the importance of organic food in today's food system?
Yeah, great question. I think they can have high importance. One of the things we know about organic foods is that they have been shown to limit consumers' exposure to pesticides and certain chemicals, which we're not fully clear on all the impact in terms of health um, challenges, but we certainly can say that they limit consumers' um, exposure to certain pesticides and other chemicals.
Okay, interesting. Next question for you is, in your opinion, just getting your opinion on this. So, what do you think are the most significant health benefits, if there are any, when it comes to consuming organic food?
Great question. And again, I think certainly limiting exposure to unnecessary chemicals, particularly pesticides, um, you know, has been shown to be what tends to be the greatest benefit from choosing organic foods. I think it's still not clear 100% um, the relation to certain health challenges that maybe come from those increased. We know that, for example, that people who do choose the largest amounts of organic foods tend to maybe have lower risks for certain cancer occurrence like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's some support for limiting or avoid, or choosing organic foods during pregnancy. Maybe there's some pregnancy complications, or challenges that can arise from non-organic foods. But again, I think we always try to encourage, from a food perspective, more plant foods, more fruits, veggies, whole grains, and if we can limit our exposure to pesticides and et cetera that come in through those foods, probably a wise choice long term.
Okay. My next question for you is, how does organic farming impact environmental sustainability compared to conventional methods?
Great point, Jamari. I'm going to be honest, that's not my expertise necessarily, but I would say certainly we want to be sustainable. I would imagine, if I were more in tune with farming, um, that you know soil quality, right? The nutrient content of the soil is probably going to impact the quality of the food, organically or not. We know maybe that the more pesticides and maybe certain fertilizers, that are used with conventional farming, um, likely again maybe translates towards the consumer. It might be cheaper, for certain reasons, or more supportive of crop yield for the farmer. But again, the downstream payout in the consumer might not necessarily, in terms of health and well-being, be favorable. But again, I think that's unclear fully at this point.
Okay. You mentioned something about methods being cheaper. So that actually leads to my next question, because I know with organic foods and how important they are and how beneficial it is, and it should be encouraged amongst everybody to at least consume those like more often, or at least try to imply that into their diet. We also know that the cost, like the affordability of it, can also be an issue amongst most people, especially with college students. Do you think the higher cost of organic food is justified?
I That's a great question. From whose perspective, right? I think certainly food prices have risen pretty considerably in the last year, two, three. Um, and somebody who might be budget conscious or have a limited food budget may not be able to participate the way some others are able to in organic foods. But that doesn't have to be a barrier necessarily, right? I think there's ways to participate, just like with regular food and maybe being budget friendly. Things like trying to buy organic food in bulk. If I choose a grain, for example, I might have a lower unit price by buying a larger quantity at one time. Frozen organic, right, which can actually be very nutrient dense because it's picked when it's at its peak of ripeness, right? Peak flavor, peak nutrient content typically as well. Um, can be a little bit less expensive. Buying local organic in season, from local farmers that use organic methods, that can be a way to keep costs down. Um, are food prices justified now, even if they're conventional? I don't know how to maybe answer from that perspective, but I would say, anybody who wants to maybe participate in organic, there's always a way. And again, I think it doesn't have to be all in or all out. It can be pick your battles. Maybe there's foods that somebody eats 5 apples a day, that to maybe if they're considering organic, maybe that's a place because they're including one food regularly, right? You could maybe buy an organic apple bag, might be a little bit more expensive, but it could still be within your budget, but also maybe limit your exposure to unnecessary pesticides, etc.
Right, got you. Now, I also know another concern with organic foods is people are usually skeptical of that label when they usually see it on products in grocery stores and things of that nature. So they're never too sure whether or not if a certain produce that they're getting is indeed healthy or if it's just something slapped on a label for a better value price or whatnot. So my question for you is, or for on that matter is, how do you address misconceptions or debates about organic food within your field of expertise?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's a question I get regularly. To be able to label a food organic, it has to meet certain criteria. If a food is, it's typically less about the food and more about how the food is farmed or raised. It has to be, organic foods limit pesticide use and certain fertilizer use, right, and chemical use. They tend not to be genetically engineered, right, or radiated or treated with radiation. Certain veggies and fruits and spices, for example, eggs in the shell might be irradiated to help help um, kill bacteria, potential growth for bacteria. Food safety oriented or organic can't. Organically raised animals, no antibiotics, no growth hormones, um, the option for those animals to move about freely if they want to. So I feel confident as much as I think you can, with that label that I'm at least getting a certain, there's a certain expectation maybe that's met of how those are raised, right? A certain amount of years before for that ground or that farmland to be free of those pesticides and chemicals and certain fertilizers before I can actually harvest something and consider it organic and right organic. Certain foods, if they're made up of more than one ingredient, at least 95% of those ingredients have to be organic for the whole product to be called organic. There's a lot of, I want to say trickery, but natural. There's other words that companies might use to try to give us the sense that something is organic, but really it's that USDA organic label that really we're looking for. That really is probably the most encompassing of all the things if we were to be concerned about stuff, would be wisest to look for.
All right. So with that all being explained and your knowledge on the matter, what role do you think what role should educational institutions play in promoting the awareness of organic food? So like in places like Purchase College or any other institution?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think education, right? Information, philosophies, knowledge is always the precursor to new experience, which is the precursor to wisdom, right? So getting information is one thing, but applying it, maybe so that students or consumers can make the most, the wisest and most skillful and beneficial choice for themselves. I think as institutions, we have an obligation for safety and health and well-being, right? Um, I've worked with many institutions that feel they couldn't support organic, right? But always there's a way to at least kind of highlight maybe certain aspects of organic in certain areas, right? Creating an option for individuals to allow greater choice. So yeah, I always think there's opportunity to highlight organic and incorporate it, especially if a chef or a team, a business team is, or a food, cultural, team is invested in that. There's always a way to do everything, especially if the students or the consumer use it, if they're willing to use their, voices to advocate for it, right? More people that want something, the likelihood is it's going to help bring it to fruition, and find a balance there between cost and, right, you know, desire to have it.
Right, right. I can, yeah, because I know definitely for sure when it comes to a lot of the knowledge on organic foods, it's probably not applied properly. There's not enough research out there on a certain particular product. So it leads to a lot of misconception, a lot of misunderstandings on the actual,
Sure.
like on the legitimate standpoints, like the legitimate points about organic food overall, or just normal healthy produce in general. So,
Most people don't know about it. I would agree.
yeah.
So, yep.
Yeah, so with that being said, also leading into the next question, are there any scientific limitations or gaps in the research regarding organic food benefits?
No, that's a great question too. Again, I don't know that I'm the expert by any means on that, but I would imagine there are. I think research requires money, and depending on, what entity is willing to, fund that type of research, I would imagine probably making or exploring the connection between actual incidence of disease, right? Certain cancers and, consumption of organic versus, conventional foods probably would be a great tie-in. And again, why that doesn't happen more often certainly probably is I would imagine a financial, right? Maybe even in the context of kind of what we're seeing in the government at this point in terms of decreases in funding for certain things. Um, it might have to come more from independent, you know, entities. But yeah, I would imagine there are lots of gaps. Maybe how organic farming methods could be more supportive of sustainability and, right, health and well-being and affordability, could be great. Could we raise, healthier crops for less, right, to be less expensive in, overall, right? Could we support that style of farming, right, and have it benefit everybody on both ends, the producers and the consumers? Yeah, I would imagine, you know, more information, more helpful, you know, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. So, my last and final question that I have for you, I just want to get your perspective on this coming from an academic professor. How important is it for students to understand the differences between organic and conventional food systems?
I think it's very important. I think how do you make an educated or wise decision, skillful decision unless you have that information, right? We're operating in the dark in a sense. I think whether you make the decision to choose organic or conventional, at least you have that information to be able to base a decision on, right? You're starting from a place of, um, being educated in a sense on it, and then kind of how you decide to disseminate your budget towards food is going to be um, obviously very personal, but certainly you know from a place of light rather than a place of darkness. You're getting the full story so that you can make the best decision for you, right? How you choose to do that moving forward. So I absolutely, I try to bring it up in the class that I teach, um, and lots of great questions, typically arise from it. In my professional life, for sure. Even as a chef, we tried to advocate using local farmers, particularly the ones who utilize um, organic practices. They might not be able to afford necessarily the cost of the certification, right? But they utilize those organic practices. So um, we would always try to bring those into the mix for sure. Yeah, great question. Education always important, right?
Right. It's always important. And that is all the questions that I have. I want to thank you for your time. Like I know it was a hassle
Thank,
for this.
thank you, Chamali.
All right. Thank you.